All right, so last week we're in the faith chapter. There are two chapters that people have given nicknames to. 1 Corinthians 13 has been nicknamed the love chapter. And Hebrews chapter 11 has been nicknamed the faith chapter, or the Faith Hall of Fame chapter. Wouldn't be a bad title for it. It's not so much teaching us how to walk in faith. It's explaining to us some of the great faith heroes, or sharing with us some of the great faith heroes over the centuries. And today we're going to be talking about Moses. We started off, of course, we talked about Noah, we talked about Enoch, we talked about Abraham, Isaac, briefly mentioned Jacob. But now he jumps into Moses. And how many ever seen the Ten Commandments? Did you ever see that, Darrell? Most people have. There are two versions. The Hollywood version was Charlton Heston, and then there was a TV version redone. And it was a much shorter movie, and obviously didn't have the same budget that Charlton Heston's had. There are lines in that movie that I remember to this day. In the movie, the Bible doesn't make it clear. In the movie, Pharaoh's army was drowned, but as a Pharaoh never entered the water with them. He lets the soldiers kill folk, and then he goes up. So he wasn't drowned. And again, the Bible isn't clear on that. There's no mention of a new Pharaoh or anything, so it could be an accurate viewpoint. But one of my favorite lines, he had told his wife, who had a crush on Moses, before Moses knew he was Israelite, thought he was an Egyptian. And, we're going to get into a little bit of that. But the line at the end, Pharaoh said, I'm going to kill Moses and bring his heart back here, or something like that. And so when Pharaoh came back home without an army and sat down on his throne, and the woman said, I think it was his heart. Where's his heart? And Yul Brynner, playing Pharaoh, had the line of the movie, his God is God. Love that line. I got news for you, folk. Your God is God. And that's the good news. All right, so last week we talked about how Abraham and Sarah Abraham and his descendants, rather, didn't fix. Now, I'm sure a lot of his descendants did, but the key descendants, from Abraham there was Isaac, then Jacob's 12 sons. And they're talking about the faith that they had, that they looked beyond the land that their children would one day inherit. None of these people ever owned what we call Israel today. It was much bigger. What God gave Israel initially was much, much bigger. The deal is that there was a prime minister in England England owned Israel. And back before the United Nations, in the days of the League of Nations, he was a Christian man. He wanted to give the land of Israel to the Jews. And with all the logistics going on between those in the League of Nations who wanted it and didn't want it, it never got done. And then suddenly we had the United Nations, and years later, that guy was dead now, that leader in Britain, Prime Minister, is dead. But the thing had, the plan was in motion. They finally were able to get it done, but when Britain fought a war, there were, I wish I could remember the war. Anyway, there were some Muslims, a very famous Muslim, helped Britain win that war. Do you know who that was? At any rate, because of that, instead of giving Israel all the land that the original prime minister wanted to give to them, they started dividing it up between the Muslim factions that helped Britain win that war and Israel. So Israel got a much smaller portion of land. Isn't it funny? They're still fighting over that land over there. But they got a much smaller portion of land than the original prime minister of Britain wanted to give them. And of course, like I say, he was dead by the time it happened in the United Nations. So probably the next prime minister wasn't as fervent about it. So he just started Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia, you've seen the movie, was the Muslim that helped Britain. Why did that just pop in my mind? I don't know. So Israel today doesn't have near the land they had back in the Bible days. But the most famous Bible characters that were the beginning of the nation of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob, never owned the land. They were all dead by the time the descendants of Abraham were delivered from Pharaoh. The first Pharaoh that made Joseph second in command loved Joseph, and therefore loved Joseph's family. He said, have him move here. But when that Pharaoh died, he must have lived quite a while, because when that Pharaoh died, that family, of course, it had grown quite a bit during slavery, but the reason slavery came into being is because the new Pharaoh said, we've got to enslave these people. They're multiplying too much. They will overthrow us. And so they enslaved Israel. And by the time they were out, none of the main characters, Abraham's descendants, it was the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, which had multiplied, and they're the ones that finally took with Moses led them out, and then finally Joshua led them over into the promised land. So it was quite a lesson, but they were saying, according to last week's lesson, somehow they knew, I think, as time went on, we're not going to be there, it's going to be our children's children. And so they set their sights. We would never know that without the book of Hebrews. They set their sights on the heavenly. They believed the God who promised them that land had another land for them and for you and me that we call heaven. And they were looking for a city, and the city that would come to my mind, of course, is the city of New Jerusalem. So, anyway, I don't want to get off, so I'm going to go on. I had some things come up in my mind about China, what's going on right now, that makes me believe we're getting really close to the trumpet. But I won't talk about that right now. So after we talked about that last week, in verses 17, 18, and 19, now we're going to start this week, verses 20 through 27. We're going to start, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Now remember, here was the blessings he blessed Jacob with. Now let me say, Isaac and Rebekah, they're typical parents. They have twin sons. Isaac loves Esau. Esau's a man's man. He goes out and hunts. Rebekah likes the softer Jacob. And it's coming to the point where Abraham gave a prophetic blessing to Isaac, which in essence was passing on the blessing of God on Abraham to his son. Isaac blessed both his sons, but one was a blessing that were Jacob the younger. And you know, the ways of God are amazing. I've shared this with you a lot. Back in those days, if you had 7 sons, then the inheritance would be divided 8 ways. The oldest son would get 2 of those helpings, and the other 6 would get 1 apiece. In other words, the oldest son received a double portion. Here's where God just throws curveball. And you swing and you miss. Isaac was not the oldest son of Abraham. Ishmael was. But Ishmael wasn't the promised son. In other words, Sarah wasn't the mother. So the second-born of Abraham got the blessing, not the firstborn. Jacob and Esau were twins. When twins are born, the one out first gets a double portion. That was Esau. But I don't have time to go through all that story. Esau sold his birthright. Rebekah helped Jacob deceive because Isaac's vision was gone. She put a coat made of animal fur because Esau was a hairy guy. And so when Esau's supposed to come in to get blessed, he's supposed to go out and hunt for venison and come in because his dad loved the venison the way Esau cooked it. So in the meantime, Mom says, Jacob, come here. And she evidently she didn't have venison. They just had some livestock that she put all the spices in to make it taste like venison. And she put animal fur on Jacob's chest. So the blind Isaac felt. And he said, you got the voice of Jacob. He said, no, I'm Esau. And so he gave the blessing that he had for Esau to Jacob. Now, because these are prophetic blessings, you can't take them back. So Esau comes in expecting the blessing of the firstborn, and it had already been given away, and he breaks into tears. Give me a blessing, give me a blessing. And so he finally blesses them, but it's not the blessing that he wanted. And so in the first 2 generations after Abraham, it was the second-born that received the blessing. Just a strange little twist to it. So, because of the time, I'm not going to go through all those, but you can read the blessings he gave. I put some verses down there. So now down to verse 21. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning upon the top of his staff. Now, why did he bless both of the sons? Again, he's passing on the blessings God gave Abraham. He got 12 sons. God intends on 12 tribes. But instead of Joseph, there is no tribe of Joseph. Instead, Isaac gave a prophetic blessing to Manasseh and Ephraim, the 2 sons of Joseph. And so there's actually 2 tribes of Joseph, who was not a firstborn. He was one of the younger sons. So, again, even though God set up this thing for wills, so to speak, when you die, this person gets this, it never worked out that way in the immediate lineage of Abraham. A couple times it was second-born, and this time it was farther down the list of 12. He might have been the 11th born. I'd have to double-check that. But he was way down the list. But God raised him up and did great miracles through him in the land of Egypt. And so God blesses him. So down here, again, Jacob is so old now. When he was dying, he called all his sons in, and instead of blessing Joseph, he blessed the 2 children of Joseph. And so By faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. He wanted them, when they left Egypt, to take his bones to the promised land to bury. So Joseph obviously was a man of renown when he was alive. But after he died and the future Israelites kept having babies, they enslaved him, as I said earlier. So Joseph, never seen the promised land, heard about it when he was back home growing up. And so he wanted his bones taken back to the promised land. Now flip it over if you would. And I made reference to what I just shared with you. Under the law, the firstborn son received a double portion. But prior to the law, Abraham's secondborn son received the promise, and Isaac's secondborn son received the promise. Jacob's thirdborn son became the father of the priesthood, which was Aaron. And his fourthborn son became the father of the everlasting king. So Joseph believed in the promised land and prophesied that his descendants would bury him there. So now let's get to Moses. The two most famous characters of the Old Testament, without question, are Abraham and Moses. David would certainly come in third, King David. And then you would have the prophets and so forth that wrote books, some of them rather large. But if you ask somebody that's hardly ever been in church who the most famous people of the Old Testament, if they've been there at all, where they know any people, I'm sure it would either be Abraham or Moses they would mention. Now, Abraham was reverenced in the Jewish nation to this day. He's actually also reverenced in the religion of Islam, because he's the father of Ishmael, and Muslims believe that he was the selection of God. So Abraham's important as a Jew, and he's important to those who practice Islam. But when it comes to Moses, of course, he would be more famous just to the Jews, not so much to Islam. So, proper child. By the way, I preach the way those parents, Abraham blessed his children, Isaac blessed his children, Jacob blessed his children. I preached a couple times in my career. We need to learn how to bless our children. And we're not going to bless them prophetically in all likelihood. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but that would be rare today, because we're not dealing with special promises from God to our children. But we can still learn, when we open our mouth, bless our children. Don't call them losers, don't call them bums, don't call them this, don't call them that. Tell them that they're winners. Just find ways, with the words coming out of your mouth, to praise your children. And I think that's an important practice that the Jews were good at. Now again, theirs was a little beyond what we would do, because they were prophetic blessings. All right, so Exodus 1. Oh wait, verse 23, up above first. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. So Moses' parents knew there was just a baby here. The baby hadn't done a thing. But they knew, as slaves of Egypt, Mom and Dad looked at that boy and knew that he was something. Pharaoh thought they were having too many babies and had an edict out to kill some of them. So Sarah's sister, Moses' mother, you know the story. She made a little boat out of branches and pitched it so it wouldn't sink. And sent him down the river, and Miriam, his older sister, run down the river to see what be on the shore, to see what would become of him. And by the hand of God, he sailed right into where Pharaoh's daughter was taking a bath. And Pharaoh's daughter picked that baby up out of the water, and it's a God thing. She loved that baby instantly. Didn't check to see if it was a Jew or figure out where he came from. She just seen it was a little child, and she wanted that child. So Miriam, when Moses' sister, went up and said, "Do you need a handmaiden to watch your child?" So she finagled to get Moses' real mother into the house of Pharaoh's daughter, who did not know that was the child's mother. And she got to watch the child grow up, all from the finaglings of a little girl. Isn't that amazing? That's a beautiful story. So she helped raise the child for Pharaoh's daughter. Now, Exodus 1:22, and Pharaoh charged all of his people, saying, "Every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." He was trying to get rid of some of the boys, I'm sure, to keep more children from being born. Verse 7, then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, that's the next verse down, Exodus 2, verses 6 to 10. And when she had opened it, in other words, when Pharaoh's daughter had opened this little craft, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Oh, I didn't see, I misspoke a moment ago. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take the child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew. She brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." So that's the story. What we never find out in the Scripture is how Pharaoh's daughter explained she had a son to the Pharaoh. We never understand that. I suppose Pharaohs were busy and probably doing other things. Maybe Pharaoh's daughter was married by then and had other children. I don't know. And Dad just didn't pay much of attention. So Dad was never concerned about the child. By Dad, I mean Pharaoh, was never concerned about the child Moses. If only he had known, he'd have been a bit concerned. And so, matter of fact, probably another grandson. I better not state this. I haven't read the entire history of Moses for a while, so I'm going to back off on that. I was going to suggest that, because that's just from the movie, I think, that the new Pharaoh, they suggest that Moses would have become the next Pharaoh. Most theologians doubt that. In the movie, it's presented that he'd be the next Pharaoh. Very unlikely, because, again, you're dealing with firstborns, and even in Egypt. So that was probably just put in there for the movie, and so you had someone they thought was his brother become the next Pharaoh. But we have no idea how all of that played out whatsoever. But the movie was good, I'll say that. But at any rate, so the mother of Moses got to nurse him, and Miriam, his sister, probably 10, 12 years old, according to one commentary, followed the vessel down the river, and God just worked everything out. The child lived, didn't get drowned, and it was another miracle story how God did things, because when God wants to do something His way, there is no human way that can reverse it. So, and then I already commented on that. I wonder how Pharaoh's daughter passed Moses off as her son. Do not know that. Verse 24, back in Hebrews 11 again. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, I want you to look at Exodus 2, 11 to 12, verse 15. And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he had discovered that he is a Hebrew, living as an Egyptian. And he probably always, it was probably a God-given thing, probably always had sympathy for the slaves, because slaves are never treated well. Now, I don't mean never a single time. I mean, as a matter of fact, wherever there's slaves, they get abused. Now, I think there have been very kind slave owners over time. Certainly in the history of Israel, there were slaves that loved their owners so much that when the year of Jubilee came along where they could be free, they didn't want to leave their owner's house, and they would get an awl, A-W-L, driven through their ear as a sign that they wanted to forever belong to that slave owner. So there have been throughout history some people who really treated slaves as humans. You and I don't quite understand that, because we can't figure out how any human can think they have a right to own another human. That's beyond our ability to reason. We don't understand it. But the way it happened in Israel with a fellow Jew, there were two types of slaves in Israel. One was the survivors of an enemy that Israel was at war with. A conquering country often enslaved the people of the country they conquered. So you had the villains that were fighting against you, so to speak, become slaves. But also Israel had a law that if they couldn't pay their bills, they could sell themselves into slavery and get their bills paid that way. And so that's how some Israels ended up in this idea of being a slave to a fellow Jew. They would sell themselves willfully into slavery to get their bills paid. And then again, once every 50 years was the year of Jubilee, and whatever you owed was forgiven throughout Israel. I doubt that that's going on in Israel nowadays, but that was in the Old Testament era. Once every 50 years, twice a century. If you were smart, you'd go into real heavy debt the 49th year. But the trouble is, in the 49th year, you'd probably have trouble finding anybody to lend you money, because they know 1 year from now they're going to have to forgive it. So I'm sure it was handled a certain way. Now, so he's seen in back under verse 25. Well, let me read 24 and 5 again, and then I'll get back into verse Exodus there, chapter of Exodus. By faith, Moses, when he had come to years, refused to be called the Pharaoh's daughter, and this is what it says next. Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. So he had been the king's son. He had seen for years the abuse of slaves. These slaves were building pyramids. Can you imagine in those days how difficult that work was? You had to get a bunch of them together to pull big stones. I'm sure they had all kinds of pulleys. Pulleys have been around forever, because you know how the pyramids are shaped. They had to get away. Why didn't they build them like the Aztecs in South America? Well, with that, the Aztecs were killed by the Mexicans, the Spaniards. So it would have been Mexico where the Aztecs lived, right? Because the people from Spain came over. People say how rude we are. We drove the Indians out of their homeland, and we stole land from Mexico. Well, Mexico killed the Aztecs to get that land. So wherever there's been people, there's been war. And one rule of war is the winner of the war makes the choices. That's why we better keep our eyes on China. Poor China. Just let me throw this in real quick. Poor China. They're getting a leg up spending so much more money on their military than we are right now. Getting a leg up thinking we're not far from pushing America around. About the time they think they get military superiority, a rapture is going to occur. A guy's going to show up on the scene that the Bible calls the Antichrist, and he's going to put China in its place. Isn't it amazing? We huff and we puff and we think we're going to blow the house down, and God's got other plans. But anyway, now I could be wrong. By that I mean the rapture could be decades away yet. China might push people around for a while. But it sure feels like it's not going to be that far in the distance. So it came to a point, what does it mean when it said he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season? And so that's where we read the story that we had just referred to. When Moses was grown, he went and recognized that these were his people, these slaves were his people, and he seen an Egyptian beating with a whip one of the slaves, something he would have witnessed for years. But now, identifying them with them as a fellow, what we would call Jew, but they weren't really Jews yet, they were just descendants of Abraham. So now he's seen them as family. And to protect the Jew, he killed the Egyptian. So now suddenly, Moses has to flee for his life, because Pharaoh's not real happy with this. And Pharaoh might have gotten wind. Now, if it was really Pharaoh's son, it would have been okay. They can kill whoever they want. But in this case, he must have gotten wind. We don't have the whole story. He must have gotten wind that he figured out he's a Jew. And I'm going to use the Jew, even though they weren't called that yet. And so Pharaoh would have been after him. So Moses fled. So when you understand, when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by the well, and that's where he meant his future wife. And you've seen that in the movie. So Moses either always knew he was a Hebrew, or he discovered it as a man of 40 years of age. Remember, Moses' life, he died when he was 120, and God had a neat package. 3 different 40-year periods. When he was born, he lived 40 years in Egypt. He killed an Egyptian. He lived 40 years in the Midian area. Had a wife and at least one son, maybe more. And then for 40 years, his last 40 years, he becomes the mighty prophet of God who leads Israel. We'll call Israel. They weren't even in Israel yet. But he leads them to the promised land. And of course he doesn't get to go over because he disobeyed God. And he goes up on the mountain and God takes him home to heaven. He dies, in other words, and well, to paradise anyway. And but it says here that the reason he was willing to give Egypt up because he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God, and rather than to continue to live under the auspices of being a child of Egypt and enjoy all the blessings that was. So the question I had, after down in verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ. Of course, he didn't think in terms of Christ. He thought in terms of God. But this is New Testament epistle, so and I haven't checked the modern translations. I'm guessing they threw the word God in there instead of Christ. You know what's funny? We're talking about Moses, the fellow that ends up being Moses' second-hand man and takes over when Moses' ministry to the Jews is over, is Joseph. Why do I bring that out? Because the Hebrew for Joseph is the same as the Greek for Jesus. So there's at least one New Testament verse. Joshua. Who was I? Joseph. I was back to Joseph. Yeah, Joshua. Jesus. But anyway, that's Spanish, not Greek nor Hebrew. But so there's in the King James there's a New Testament verse that is confusing because it said if Jesus had given them rest. Well, the reason it's confusing, the modern translations render it, if Joshua had given them rest. He's the one that led them into the promised land. Then there would be no need for another rest, which gets into the Melchizedek stuff. So those are the same names, but here it's talking about Moses chooses to suffer. How's that word? Reproach of Christ, and who is, of course, Jesus. But it said he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, but he endured as seeing him who is visible. So the question is, he killed that Egyptian. Right before the question, he killed that Egyptian knowing that his life of ease would be over. The minute he killed that Egyptian, he knew that fairy tale was over. And the Hebrew passage tells us that he believed God's promise to his ancestors would come to pass, and that was the wealth he desired. So the question, how is running for his life considered forsaking Egypt by faith? Usually we don't acquaint or we don't connect faith with running. So he runs for his life, but the answer I put down, his forsaking Egypt took place when he chose to defend a Hebrew slave. He did that by faith, knowing that he would then have to run for his life. So the running for his life was not the thing he was doing by faith. It was saving a fellow Jew. I don't know what to call him at that time. But a countryman, a fellow, I'll just say Jew. But anyway, he did that knowing that party time was over. Now, I titled this, because I didn't have a long time to look at it today, Discovering Who You Are. So he grows up thinking he's a descendant of the most powerful and wealthiest guy in Egypt, who was the superpower of the day. That's a pretty good upbringing. So that's what he grows up. Now, I don't know. The reason I worded it iffy in here, his mother got to raise him, help raise him. Maybe she told him, "You're my child." We don't know. Part of me says, no, she wouldn't do that, because if it was found out, they would never let her see him again. So, I don't know exactly how. Maybe a grown-up Miriam, his sister, told him. At some point, he finds out He's one of them. And it's an amazing thing when we find out who we are, things change. And that's why I keep saying you have to study and study and study the Scripture and find out what God promises you, says about you to you, or to you about you, rather. Find out what God says, because things happen when we find out who we are. It changes our perspective. It changes everything. Changed Moses, living in the lap of luxury for 40 years. 40 years, 1/3 of his life. The next 40, he lives on the backside of a desert somewhere, up in Miriam. Not Miriam, that's his wife, I think. Land of, I read the country there, but I can't, Midian, I think. Now he's not living in nice palaces, he's living outside, he's taking care of the animals, he's doing all kinds of things for 40 years. Thought he knew who he was in Egypt. When he finds out he's one of them in Egypt, it changes everything in his perspective and makes him spend the next 40 years somewhere else. At the end of those 40 years, he sees a burning bush. And the bush isn't going away. The fire is not destroying the bush. And if that wouldn't be scary enough, he hears a voice. The bush is talking to him. And I don't mean President Bush. So he has a new discovery of who he is. This time he discovers he's the chosen of God to lead those slaves out of Egypt. And what does that do? It affects his next 40 years. So we have two examples in the life of Moses where he discovered who he was. So the first discovery was more of just a human thing. Okay, I'm not this, I'm this. 40 years later, it was an eye-opening, amazing thing. And right around the corner, someone else heard that and thought they were talking to him. Life of Brian, well, that's the name of it. There was a silly movie called The Life of Brian, where this other guy was up on the mountain. When God was speaking to Moses, he thought God was speaking to him. So he was... You ever see that movie? The Life of Brian, just silly. But unfortunately, Brian didn't discover who he was. But Moses figured it out twice. So again, I challenge you in closing. Keep digging in the Word. Because the more you discover who you are in Christ, the more it impacts all the choices you make.